Mr. Secretary, friends and colleagues, let me thank the Scientific Committee for allowing me to introduce the EASL Recognition Award to Professor Giovanna Fattovich. Giovanna has been, over the last 3 decades, one of the most influential persons in our clinical thinking on hepatitis B. And it's probably worth recapitulating her career to understand why she's been so successful. Giovanna was born in Venice, but actually you may consider her as a refugee, since a few years before her parents, Italians, had fled from Dalmatia, which had been an Italian protectorate, but after the war changed hands, and they were forced to come back as refugees. Giovanna's family settled in Venice, and her father, who was originally an economist, became the director of the Lagoon Navigation Company. I guess that this part of Giovanna's family history explains some of her strong willingness and her sense of duty, which made her so successful in pursuing her scientific research. She took some part of her schooling in the United States and actually graduated in California at the Santana High School. Once she came back to Italy, she started studying medicine in Padua, and very soon, as an undergraduate, she became involved in clinical and research hepatology, since she was affiliated to the lab of Professor Giuseppe Realdi, who was the chief of the liver research unit at the University of Padua. This was an extremely productive environment at the moment, with people such as Alfredo Alberti staying there and pushing her to do clinical and research jobs in the field of hepatitis B. Actually, she was together with them when the first observations on the relationship between the distribution of HBV antigens in liver cells, HBV replication, and the clinical and histological features of HBV-related chronic liver disease were published. Meanwhile, after graduation, she kept working in the liver research unit, although as a volunteer. At the time, there were not many jobs for newly graduate physicians in Italy, and she had to support herself as a general practitioner. Meanwhile, she took some time to marry with Maurizio, an anesthesiologist, and to have 2 children, Matteo and Massimo. After some years as a volunteer, she got a fellowship, and in 1981, she became an assistant professor at the University of Padua. This year, in terms of research for her, were extremely productive, and 2 of the papers, which were at their time most original in terms of research on treatment of hepatitis B, came under her name. Levamisole, an immunostimulant drug originally devised as a treatment for elephantiasis, was hypothesized on a sound laboratory basis at the time to be possibly supportive of other antivirals, and the only antiviral of clinical relevance at the time was interferon. So they went into studying levamisole as a single agent with some promising results, but then did not confirm this result when levamisole was put together with interferon alpha. But this was certainly not the only research that Giovanna did during that period. Some of their papers, and you may see that the names in different orders are all the same for the group, with Giovanna always in the front position. Some of these papers are still some of the most quoted papers on the natural course of untreated chronic hepatitis B, and remain a very important set of observations for Western population with chronic hepatitis B. The real turning point in her research career, after staying for a number of years in Padua with the group of Professor Realdi, you may recognize some of the other people here, all accomplished hepatologists, some of which have already retired. The real turning point came when Giovanna met in the setting of the Eurohept. which was an European concerted action on viral hepatitis. When Giovanna met with Sol Koshal, their way of running Eurohept was extremely important and extremely innovative at the time. If you think that back in the late 80s, early 90s, communication between centers was restricted to mail, to surface mail or faxes. There was no World Wide Web. Data exchange were certainly difficult, and just the first use of medical computers and of computing in general was starting. You may realize that this huge effort to produce a multinational database dealing with first with patients with hepatitis B, then with patients with hepatitis C, was a strongly innovative feature. Most of the people which were involved in Eurohept are or have been very active at an EASL level. You may recognize here Sol Koshal, Stefanos Giannis, Piero Almasio, but and many others of whom I didn't trace the picture. But certainly Giovanna was sort of the spokesperson of the group in terms of presenting the result of the group's research. Here you can see Howard Thomas together with many others. But what's left of Eurohept is the large amount of papers, all published at the highest level, papers which illustrate the role of hepatitis B in causing morbidity and mortality in chronic hepatitis B, compensated and decompensated hep B cirrhosis, transition to hepatocellular carcinoma, and in the last phase of Eurohept also hepatitis C was covered. This paper remains, again, some of the most important reference work on chronic hepatitis B and on chronic hepatitis C and on their untreated course. Giovanna's career was not so fortunate in terms of academia. She had to move to get a position as associate professor to Verona from Padua. She there continued her clinical and research and teaching work, coordinating a large number of undergraduate and postgraduate students. But certainly she had a problematic perspective in terms of career development, since the local establishment did favor local candidates over the two enormous merits of Giovanna. And this probably was somewhat functional to an early retirement, which she took in 2015. But certainly during this period, and even after this period, Giovanna has been very active in teaching students, undergraduate and postgraduate, and also in representing the women, the Italian women hepatologists, as you can see here in this picture. Giovanna now has been a few years into retirement, although she keeps lively clinical activity outside the academia. She travels with her husband in rather difficult to visit locations, but mainly she has now 3 beautiful grandchildren. So I guess that we should congratulate Giovanna and tell her, Giovanna, well deserved. Thank you.